facing one of the biggest threats in human history.
Welcome to ASEAN Peoples Speak, Season 4. I'm Regine Jessica Dumrica Abuel, your host for this podcast. Last season, we explored how technology, digitalization, and AI or artificial intelligence are impacting human rights in ASEAN. Building on those insights and their significance to our region, we're now diving into a theme that's close to all of us: environmental rights and climate change in ASEAN. To start our first episode, we are joined by an environmental human rights defender who's been working on the ground across the ASEAN region. She will provide a deeper understanding of the current landscape of environmental protection and climate change action in ASEAN. She is currently a member of the Secretariat of the Asia Pacific Network of Environmental Defenders, or APNED, a regional solidarity network built by and for environmental defenders. She also works as a networking and international linkages staff of the Center for Environmental Concerns, Philippines. She majored in environmental anthropology as an undergraduate at Okayama University, Japan, where she produced a thesis on reclamation projects in Manila Bay, Philippines. Everyone, let us welcome our first guest of the season, Miss Mattie Balagat. Hello, Mattie.
And to everyone listening. Thanks so much for having me and AppMed in this podcast episode.
Yes, and thank you also for joining us. And we look forward to whatever you will share to us in this very first episode of season 4. So, since we're diving into environmental protection and environmental rights, particularly in the ASEAN region, can you share with us, Mattie, your experiences and what do you think is the current state of environmental protection and climate change action in ASEAN? How do you think this issue impacts the rights of people across Southeast Asia?
So I think definitely climate change is really a prominent issue. And then you have with the climate crisis so many other interlinked crises. You have biodiversity loss and the issue of pollution in both our marine and also landscapes. When it comes to climate, it's really something I take personally. Also as a climate and environmental justice advocate. Just this past week, we had a really strong typhoon that hit the Philippines, and it really brought a lot of loss in lives, property, and also crops. And it really highlights, I think, how vulnerable our nation, the Philippines, is. And of course, the Philippines is not alone in being very climate vulnerable. You also have other countries in Southeast Asia that are just as vulnerable as us. We, Indonesia, Myanmar, Vietnam, we always rank among the top most at risk of very extreme climate events.
So you've mentioned about the environmental issues as affecting not just like one nation, but different countries as well. And I'd like to relate this, for example, in typhoons or strong winds or heavy rains, not just in a particular country, but it could actually affect neighboring countries as well. So from that, you mentioned that this issue is not just confined in a country, but in the ASEAN region as well. So maybe you can give us an example of some of these issues or some of these things that have affected not just one country, but different countries as well.
Yes, for sure. So our countries in the Southeast Asia, as we have like coastlines that are close to the Pacific Ocean, it's very common for our coastal communities to be affected by flooding. We also have the experience of having more frequent and stronger weather-related events such as droughts, which affect, of course, agricultural output. And then with that, it also affects the livelihood security of a lot of people, as well as food security. So when it comes to climate crisis, it's always interlinked the right to a healthy environment and the right to life generally, because of course, we talk about environment not just as a landscape or something that's isolated, but as landscapes that give us life, that give us culture and livelihood. So if we have these environmental crises that are coming each year more and more, you have a lot of lives on the line. And that's like the reality in the ASEAN right now, which is why environment is really something that should be everyone's priority, from the governments to corporations to also civil society. And to add to, I guess, climate vulnerability of our countries, we also have this added issue of development aggression. And when I say development
Mm.
aggression, yeah, this usually comes in the form of infrastructure projects, or sometimes even build as something like climate or green, eco-friendly,
Mm-hmm.
or the sort, but they usually end up trampling people's rights to the environment, people's rights. There's plenty of examples like this in Southeast Asia that increase our vulnerability. So, example in Cambodia and Indonesia, you usually have a lot of widespread land conversion. So you have the issue of plantations such as palm oil or rubber. In the Mekong region, you also have like the river, and with that, the issue of transboundary water management. So
Mm.
when it comes to climate, something also that is a top agenda of our countries is renewable energy. But the danger of this is it comes at the cost of communities. So example, usually mega dams are proposed, and this ends up
Mm.
trampling a lot of communities' rights, in the sense that they are not fully informed, or they don't
Yes.
fully get the benefits from these projects. But because it's in like for the sake of development or for the sake of sustainable development, it sort of justifies this trampling of rights of communities. So that's something that comes hand in hand with all the environmental and climate issues that Southeast Asia is facing. I think that's
Yeah.
an overview.
And I'd like to comment on what you said a while ago that sometimes in the context of development, there are things or rights that are compromised. So I'd like to, I guess, pick up from what you said that sometimes the construction of mega dams, although this is for a good purpose, but still some rights, environmental issues also arise. But not just that, we also talk about IP issues, or people that will be relocated or moved to another place are not very well informed about these developments, or the plans for their relocation. So thank you for giving us some concrete examples of these things across the ASEAN region. Now, I'd like to focus more on, I guess, climate change in particular. What do you think are the main challenges that ASEAN faces in addressing climate change? And how has regional cooperation evolved throughout these years in tackling these issues?
When it comes to climate, I think one thorny issue is this argument that Southeast Asian nations, being not like developing countries, not fully developed or industrialized nations, like we get a free pass, I guess, to
Mm.
develop in the way that countries in the global north have, which is heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So the point of showing in the climate crisis that it is in fact the global north countries which have industrialized first that are responsible is that we all may have like common responsibilities when it comes to say like decreasing emissions, of course, protecting our environments. But when it comes to that, because our contribution is very different, there's also a concept of differentiating responsibilities. So
Yes. Yes.
example like we have the COP29 coming up. So this is the
Yes.
conference of the parties to the UN framework on climate change. Um, One of the hot topics there is going to be loss and damage.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically global south countries trying to seek reparations from the global north for essentially causing the climate crisis. And the way that we want these reparations is, of course, funds. to go towards climate adaptation and mitigation in our countries because our countries are the most vulnerable to climate crisis and experience the brunt of the impacts. So
Yes.
that's one thing.
Yes, and you've actually mentioned about common but differentiated responsibilities, right? And can we touch upon this a little bit?
Yes.
Because you've all also mentioned about COP, or that supreme decision-making body of the UN framework for the Convention of Climate Change, or UNFCCC. And you've mentioned also that ASEAN nations mostly are developing countries, correct? And since we're all, or most of us, belong to that category or to that kind of state, what do you think is the ASEAN region doing on its part, or how do you think the role of ASEAN nations could be when it comes to these loss and damages, or these consequential actions, or I mean, these actions that are expected from developing countries like those coming from the ASEAN region?
Yeah, at this international arenas, it's actually quite clear that there's a divide between so-called developed and developing countries because, of course, developing countries are what we term as the global south, being sort of like the poster child of the climate crisis. We're essentially there to really lobby for more support, more funds, financing from the global north. So that's in the case of loss and damage. But at the same time, speaking on this common responsibility, it's also on us to sort of affirm our responsibilities under the Paris Agreement to really start
Mm.
on this phase out from fossil fuels and also chart a sort of more sustainable development pathway. So one thing is that of course, we have to be supporting what local communities do when it comes to climate adaptation. Like, example, what communities do after these sort of calamities, what kind of mutual aid systems they have, or what kind of long term relief systems they have, or livelihood programs they might have. Those are kinds of programs that should be supported and should be highlighted at these international arenas in order for us to say that, of course, first we need financing in order to actually adapt to the impacts of climate change. And
Mhm.
second, this is like the image of what kind of world we want to build that is moving away from fossil fuels and is really upholding the rights of communities. So that's I think that's a prime opportunity that ASEAN countries should take at these international arenas, and we're definitely in the position to do that.
Ah, that's very nice. And I'd like to pick up from what you said, because this is actually a very good way to highlight that ASEAN, although it's a diverse region, you have mentioned the unique challenges and strengths of ASEAN nations. And thank you for letting us know your view on what are the ways that the ASEAN nations, or in the ASEAN context, sets it apart from other regions when it comes to environmental protection. And I'd like to pick up from what you said a while ago, that this could be an advantage, and maybe in terms of negotiating loss and damages, and maybe also funding coming from developed countries, and their contribution to their commitment to the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement. This is a very nice platform, or this is a very nice way of putting it, that we are in a position where we can negotiate and at the same time demand from developed countries some liability, or at least accountability. Yes, some
Yes, that's
accountability
right.
on their part, because we are the ones suffering from, or not suffering, but we are the ones who are experiencing the consequences of fossil fuels, of their carbon footprint. So I'd like to move now to that aspect of, since we've talked about the global aspect already, and how nations or states can work together to come up with a solution together. But what about the grassroots movements? How have
Mhm.
grassroots movements or advocacy groups and civil society organizations, how do you think have they been contributing to the promotion of environmental rights and influencing climate policies in ASEAN countries? Now that we've recognized the role of the states, now I'd like to ask you, what do you think are the roles or the contributions that grassroots movements or advocacy groups can make?
Of course, and as part of the Asia Pacific Network of Environmental Defenders, we're really proud of the work that frontline environmental defenders do. So, environmental human rights defenders, or EHRDs, are basically any organization that in a peaceful manner really upholds environmental rights. Um, by doing so, we protect landscapes in order to sustain our access to food, sustain our access to clean water and air. I always think that these EHRDs are the people who are the most capable of bringing about change, because on the ground we are at so-called at the last line of defense, because
Yes.
some of these development agenda, right, like projects are usually top down, and it's important on the ground to see that there are people who are already being sustained by these environments, for coastal communities who already have struggled to get a living off of like overstressed water bodies. They have to uphold their right to livelihood and uphold their right to sleep whenever there are proposals to convert the use of their coastal waters.
You've mentioned that these organizations or these groups are the last line of defense, but they could actually also be at the forefront of defending the rights of those who are vulnerable, not just, for example, indigenous peoples, but people who are actually or directly affected by developments, but are not actually, well, sometimes yes, it is indeed for development, but there's always a line that does not have to be crossed, which is one should always respect the life, the liberty, and even the property of each human being. And I'd like to comment on that by saying that organizations, advocacy groups, and civil society organizations are that crucial in that aspect of defending and protecting environmental rights. Thank you so much. I think on that note, we want to thank you for your insights and your experiences that you have shared with us, Mattie, today. It's actually just so inspiring to hear about the hard work that you have been doing, both at grassroots and even at the regional level, to protect the environment and secure a sustainable future for ASEAN. Do you have anything to say to our listeners before we part? And maybe as we will continue exploring these critical topics in upcoming episodes, and as we dive deeper into the intersection of environmental rights, climate action, and human rights in the region, I'd like to ask you for for a few words. Maybe what do you want our listeners to take home as we end our first episode for today?
Thank you, Rich, so much for this platform. And of course, before I go, I think it's really important to also state that even though environmental defenders are really doing great work in protecting our landscapes and upholding our access to resources and food, I have to say to you that the situation is very dire. So many of our countries are actually always sadly on the list of the most dangerous in the world for environmental defenders. And this is due to the fact that because environmental defenders have to go sometimes against very powerful interests when they have to defend their lands. What happens is that they are vilified and criminalized, and in some cases, they are also the victims of human rights violations, such as arrests, and also red tagging or criminalization. and even the worst case killings. So I have like it's a very grave, but it's an important fact. So something that we
Yes,
also
yes,
stand by in our network is that we have to keep fighting for protections for environmental defenders because
yes.
how will we protect our environment if the people who are protecting it are always at risk of attacks?
I
So that's
agree. I
one
agree.
thing. And on the role
Yes.
of the ASEAN too, with our network, one trend that is the increased use of the judicial system in order to silence defenders or stifle their work. So one thing that ASEAN governments and other civil society in the ASEAN should also work towards is having a genuine environmental rights framework. And this is something that's in the process at the moment, and it's at the stage of deliberation by the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. But it's at the point that we still need to assert that there be protections for environmental human rights defenders and other vulnerable groups like indigenous peoples, women, children, and elderly, and members of the gender and sexually diverse community. So that's something that I also can't
Yes.
forget to mention because it's really a flagship campaign of ours that if I may also share a very specific example. We were talking earlier about the role of ASEAN countries in leading the way in terms of sustainable development. There is something called the Just Energy Transition Partnership, where basically countries are able to gather funds in order to support more sustainable sources of energy, such as, of course, renewable sources like hydropower or solar and wind. But when it comes to the just part of just energy transition, this is where some ASEAN governments fail. So
Mm.
in July this year, we had the third anniversary of a Vietnamese environmental defender, Dang Vinh Bac, in jail. It was the third anniversary of his arrest. And the irony in this is that he was actually contributing to the just energy transition partnership
Mm.
policies. But
Mhm.
in the course of his work, he was filed tax charges and then arrested on that.
Oh.
So
Mhm.
this you see this increasing trend not only in Vietnam but also in other countries such as Cambodia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And it's
Yeah.
something
Like
that ASEAN governments
environmental defenders are being targeted not because of, I mean, they are vulnerable and at the same time at risk, because I agree with you when you said that they are the defenders of the environment, but they themselves also have to defend themselves from other threats, especially with their lives and with their property and everything else. So thank you for mentioning that to us. And we will definitely take note of those things because everything is interconnected. So the environment, for example, is not an isolated case. It is definitely something connected to each and every one of us. And it actually affects everybody, not just the environmental defenders, but also us as ordinary citizens of the ASEAN region, of our respective countries as well. So I think that's it for today. We have so many things to look forward to for this season, and we want to thank Mattie for giving us such wonderful insights for this very first episode. Thank you guys and join us again next week. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button on Spotify to stay updated and never miss an episode. You can also stay connected with us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by following at WGSCNHRMEC. For more in-depth information, visit our website at ASEANHRMEC.org. Thank you so much, guys. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged. Bye.